should have ended up together. We should have had a huge smashing affair. But there was no time, and Julie had her children with her, which is most inconvenient, I thought.
There is a certain kind of love that never announces itself. It does not arrive with declarations or grand gestures. It simply exists, quietly, steadily, like a candle that burns in a room you almost forget is lit. Christopher Plummer carried something like that for most of his adult life, and it was only in his final years, when the noise of Hollywood had faded and the need for performance had passed, that he allowed the world the smallest glimpse of it. What he revealed was not scandalous. It was not dramatic. It was, in many ways, more powerful than either of those things. It was simply true. Christopher Plummer passed away on February 5, 2021, at the age of 91, at his home in Connecticut. By then, he had lived one of the most decorated lives in the history of the performing arts, a Tony, an Oscar, an Emmy, roles that spanned Shakespeare to science fiction. But in those quiet final conversations with close friends, family, and the occasional trusted interviewer, the subject that seemed to bring the most warmth to his voice was not any role he had played or award he had received. It was Julie Andrews. And what he said about her, carefully and without fanfare, painted the picture of a bond that had lasted more than half a century. To understand what Plummer eventually revealed, you have to go back to the summer of 1964, when two very different people met on a film set in Salzburg, Austria, and found themselves sharing something neither had quite expected. Christopher Plummer had not wanted to make the sound of music. That much he admitted freely and repeatedly over the years. He was a classical stage actor with serious theatrical ambitions, and the idea of playing a singing Austrian naval captain in what he privately feared would be a saccharine family film did not exactly align with the artistic identity he had spent years building. He agreed to it, ultimately, for reasons that were practical as much as creative. But he arrived on set with a degree of reluctance that the crew noticed almost immediately. Julie Andrews arrived from an entirely different direction. She had just completed Mary Poppins, a film that would go on to earn her the Academy Award for Best Actress. She was warm, disciplined, professional, and possessed of a quality that people who worked with her consistently struggled to put into words, a kind of genuine, unforced kindness that did not feel like performance. She was also, beneath that brightness, navigating considerable personal complexity. She was a young mother. She was managing the enormous pressure of becoming one of the most recognized faces in the world almost overnight. And she was stepping into a role that would define her public image for decades to come, whether she wanted it to or not. When Plummer and Andrews first met, the contrast between them was apparent to everyone on set. He was sardonic, intellectually sharp, and wore his skepticism openly. She was optimistic, generous, and approached even the most exhausting days with a kind of graceful steadiness. By any reasonable measure, they should have been politely professional with each other and little more. Instead, something else happened entirely. The crew members who worked on The Sound of Music have, over the years, offered remarkably consistent accounts of what the atmosphere between Plummer and Andrews was like during those months of filming. There was an ease between them that developed unusually quickly, a comfort that went beyond the ordinary rapport actors build when they are required to spend long hours together. They gravitated toward each other during breaks. They talked for long stretches between takes. They teased each other in ways that suggested a familiarity that neither had manufactured. What Plummer later described, in interviews conducted toward the end of his life, was the experience of meeting someone who genuinely surprised him. He had expected a pleasant working relationship. What he encountered was a person whose company altered something in him. He spoke about how her laughter, and he mentioned her laughter more than once over the years, always with something close to wonder in his voice, had a quality that cut straight through his habitual guardedness. He was a man who had spent a great deal of energy maintaining a certain kind of distance from the world. Julie Andrews, without apparently trying to, made that distance feel unnecessary. He also spoke about the quality of her attention. In an industry built on performance, where even ordinary conversation can feel like an audition, Andrews listened to people in a way that felt entirely genuine. Plummer, who was not easily impressed and was not in the habit of offering unguarded praise, came back to this quality again and again when speaking about her. "She made people feel seen," he said. She made him feel seen. And for a man who had built his career on projecting strength and certainty, that was a more significant experience than it might sound. The filming of The Sound of Music was physically demanding and emotionally intense in ways that the finished film does not entirely communicate. The Austrian locations were beautiful but unforgiving. The schedule was relentless. The pressure of making a large-scale musical with enormous studio expectations behind it created a kind of pressure cooker environment that pushed everyone involved into closer emotional proximity than they might otherwise have chosen. In that environment, Plummer and Andrews became, in his own later words, each other's anchor. Not romantically, both were careful to honor the commitments and boundaries of their personal lives, and both were aware of how easily perception could outrun reality in a world where cameras were always nearby. But emotionally, they offered each other something genuine and sustaining. He provided her with humor and a kind of bracing, irreverent intelligence that balanced her natural warmth. She provided him with something he was more reluctant to name but ultimately did, in those final years: steadiness. A sense that the world was fundamentally all right. The scene that has been discussed most often in connection with their real dynamic is the gazebo sequence, in which their characters confess their feelings for each other through song. By all accounts, that scene was not easy to film. The weather was difficult. The hours were long. Both actors were tired in the deep, accumulated way that comes from weeks of sustained effort. And yet, by multiple accounts, including Plummer's own, something happened in the filming of that sequence that neither of them had entirely anticipated. The emotion that surfaced was real. It was not manufactured for the camera. It arose from the genuine connection between two people who had spent months in each other's company and had come to care about each other in ways that exceeded what the script required. Plummer spoke about this carefully in later years. He was precise in the way he described it, not claiming more than was true, not dramatizing what had been, at its core, a quiet and private experience. But he was also honest in a way he had not always allowed himself to be. What passed between them in moments like that, he.s. After filming wrapped and the cast and crew dispersed, the question of what would aid, was real. It was not the character. It was him. Happened to the connection Plummer and Andrews had built might have answered itself in the way most on-set relationships do, with warmth that gradually fades as the distance grows and ordinary life reasserts itself. That is the common trajectory. It was not what happened here. Over the decades that followed, they stayed in each other's lives. Not in a constant or high-profile way, but in the sustained, quiet manner of people who have made a genuine choice to remain connected. There were letters, handwritten, in an era when that was already becoming unusual, and then continuing into an era when it had become almost entirely rare. Plummer's notes were apparently characteristic of him, witty, a little self-deprecating, laced with the dry humor that was his natural mode of expression. Andrews's replies were warmer in tone but equally genuine. The correspondence continued for years. There were also reunions, at anniversary events and industry gatherings, that people who witnessed them consistently described in similar terms. When Plummer and Andrews were in the same room, something shifted. Not in a theatrical way, neither of them was performing. But there was a quality of recognition between them, an ease and an affection, that was visible even to people who did not know their history. Old friends carry a particular kind of comfort with each other. The comfort between these two was of that order, perhaps deeper. What Plummer revealed in his later years was not a secret in the tabloid sense. There was no hidden romance to expose, no dramatic truth that had been suppressed. What he revealed was something at once simpler and more profound than that, the full weight of what Julie Andrews had meant to him over the course of his life. He talked about what it had meant to make that film with her, not for his career, though he eventually made peace with The Sound of Music in ways he had once resisted, but for him personally. He said that she had changed him. That spending those months with her had softened something in him that had been harder than it needed to be. That her example, her generosity, her professionalism, her genuine goodness, had left a mark on him that did not fade. He talked about what it meant that she had remained present in his life. In an industry and a world where relationships are often transactional and connections are often temporary, the fact of her continued presence was something he named explicitly as one of the great gifts of his life. He did not take it for granted. He understood, by the end, how rare it was. And he talked, quietly, carefully, with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime working with language and knew exactly what he meant to say, about the nature of the feeling itself. It was not, he made clear, the kind of love that required action or declaration. It was not something that had needed to become anything other than what it was in order to be meaningful. It was admiration. It was gratitude. It was the particular tenderness that comes from being truly known by another person over a long period of time, and from knowing them in return. He said, in one of the accounts shared by those close to him in his final years, that what they had was something he had always been careful not to disturb. That its value lay partly in what it had never needed to be. That he had protected it not from selfishness but from respect, for her, for what they had built, for the simple fact that it was already enough. Julie Andrews has, over the years, spoken about Plummer with a consistency and a warmth that mirrors what he expressed about her. She has described him as someone who made her laugh in the particular way that only a few people in a life are capable of, genuinely, unexpectedly, from somewhere real. She has talked about what it was like to work with him, the way his intensity sharpened her own performance, the way his intelligence challenged her, the way his eventual warmth, once it emerged, was all the more meaningful for being so carefully held in reserve. She has also spoken about what it meant to have him in her life over the long term. Not in grand terms, Andrews is not given to grand terms, but in the quiet, specific language of someone describing something genuinely precious. When he passed away in February 2021, she did not make a large public statement. What she expressed was private, as most of what passed between them had always been. But those who knew her said that his loss was something she felt deeply, in the way you feel the loss of someone who has been a fixed point in your life for longer than you can entirely account for. There is a tendency, when telling stories about people who were famous and beloved, to reach for drama. To suggest hidden romances, suppressed confessions, secrets that the public was never allowed to know. The story of Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews does not require any of that. What it offers instead is something rarer in the accounts we tell about public figures, a genuine, sustained, quietly profound human connection that lasted more than 50 years and enriched both of the people who shared it. Plummer spent much of his career playing men of great force and complexity, characters who dominated rooms and bent the world to their will. In his final years, when he spoke about Julie Andrews, all of that fell away. What remained was something much simpler, a man expressing gratitude for a person who had mattered to him, in a voice that was entirely his own. He said she was his favorite. He said she made him better. He said that what they shared was something he had always wanted to keep exactly as it was, untouched, preserved, real. That is not a small thing to say. It is not a small thing to mean. And coming from Christopher Plummer, who did not say things he did not mean, it was, in the end, the truest kind of tribute one person can offer another. Some connections do not need to be defined to be understood. Some bonds do not need to be declared to be lasting. What Christopher Plummer and Julie Andrews shared over more than 5 decades was exactly that kind of bond, quiet, enduring, and in its own way, completely extraordinary.